Welcome back, friends, to Park Ranger Files. I'm glad you're here, and if you're new, settle in because tonight's compilation is not one you want to listen to alone with the lights off. I mean it. Pull the blankets up, lock the door, do whatever you need to do. Tonight we have 15 stories sent in from real people, hikers, hunters, weekend wanderers, and a few folks who had absolutely no business being as deep in those woods as they were. These are their words, their experiences, and in more than a few cases, the reasons they will never set foot on the Appalachian Trail again. Or any trail for that matter. Before we hit the first story, if you are new here, please consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell. We drop new narrations every week and you do not want to miss what's coming. This channel runs entirely on your support, and every single subscriber genuinely matters. Hit that button right now, it takes 2 seconds, and it keeps this thing alive. Story 1. My name is Dale Whitmore, and I'm a 53-year-old electrician out of Lexington, Kentucky. I've been hiking the southern sections of the Appalachian Trail off and on since I was in my late 20s. Not the kind of guy who spooks easy, and I say that not to sound tough, but because I think context matters when you hear what I'm about to tell you. This was the autumn of 2011. October, maybe late in the month, because the leaves had already turned and a lot of them were down. I was doing a solo section hike through a stretch of trail in Harlan County, deep in the Cumberland Mountains, an area I'd passed through maybe twice before and always found peaceful. The kind of country that just swallows you whole in the best possible way. Big ridges, long hollows, old-growth timber in certain pockets, and if you're moving quiet enough, black bear sign everywhere. I'd been out 3 days by the time it started. I'd set up camp in a flat spot just off the trail, well back from the ridgeline, with a good fire going and a tarp strung between 2 oaks for a lean-to shelter. The weather was cool, maybe in the low 40s by nightfall, and I remember lying in my sleeping bag listening to the fire pop and feeling as close to genuinely content as a person can feel. The first night, nothing happened. I slept straight through until first light, made coffee, watched a doe pick her way across the hollow below me. Normal morning. Started hiking north by 8 o'clock and covered maybe 9 miles before stopping to eat lunch on a rock outcropping that looked out over a valley I didn't know the name of. The view was something. Miles and miles of ridgeline rolling south into Tennessee, not another soul in sight. The second day is where things started feeling different, and I want to be careful how I describe it because it wasn't one specific thing that set it off, it was a feeling. A change in the atmosphere of the woods around me that I can only describe as a kind of held breath. Like the forest itself had decided to stop and pay attention to something. The birds, which had been loud all morning, went quiet right around mid-afternoon. Squirrels disappeared. Even the wind died down, which seemed odd for ridge-top walking, where you nearly always have some breeze. I figured a storm might be rolling in and kept moving. That night I found a different campsite, closer to a small spring, and I'd been asleep maybe 2 or 3 hours when something woke me. Not a sound, at least not one I could identify right away. It was more of a vibration, like the ground had shifted or like something very heavy had set down nearby. I lay still, listening, and then I heard it. Footsteps. Not the light random movement of a deer or a raccoon. These were deliberate, slow, evenly spaced. And they were bipedal. I'd stake my life on that. The weight behind each footfall was enough that I could feel the slight compression of the ground through my sleeping pad. Something large was walking a circle around my campsite. Not through it, around it, like it was checking the perimeter. I unzipped my sleeping bag as slowly as I could and sat up. My hand found my headlamp and I held it ready but didn't click it on. I just sat in the dark listening to those footsteps, complete one slow orbit around me and then stop. Dead silence. I waited what felt like 10 minutes. Nothing. And then from somewhere to the north of me, maybe 150 feet up the slope, came a sound I have told maybe 4 people about in the 13 years since it happened, because I know how it sounds. It was a voice, low, guttural, speaking in something that was almost language but not quite. Not any language I'd ever heard. It rose and fell in what sounded like deliberate rhythm, like a prayer or a counting, and it lasted maybe 20 seconds before stopping abruptly. Then nothing again. I did not sleep for the rest of that night. I sat with my back against an oak, headlamp on, knife out, and waited for dawn with my heart hammering in my chest. In the morning, I hiked out in 4 hours of hard walking, stopping for nothing. When I reached the trailhead, my truck was the only vehicle in the lot. I sat in the cab for a while before I could make myself drive. And I never went back to that section of trail. Not because I'm afraid, I keep telling myself, but I can never quite manufacture a reason to go back. And deep down, I think that is the same thing. I don't know what was walking around my camp that night. I don't know what was speaking in the dark above me on that hillside. But it knew I was there. I'm certain of that. And whatever it was, it made a choice not to come closer. That fact is the only thing that lets me sleep at night. And some nights, even that isn't quite enough. Story 2. I'm 29 years old and I work in marketing for a mid-sized firm in Richmond. My name is Patrice Holloway, and I am not someone who goes looking for this kind of thing. I'm not into ghost hunting or cryptid forums or any of that. I went on a hiking trip because my therapist told me to spend more time outside and get off my phone. And this is what happened. It was the June before last, a Friday through Sunday trip into Shenandoah National Park, along a stretch of the Appalachian Trail that passes through Skyland. I went with my friend Becca Sutton, who was even less outdoorsy than me, but who agreed to come because we'd bought a camping permit months earlier, and neither of us wanted to waste it. The first day and a half were genuinely wonderful. Cool mornings, wildflowers, a black bear we spotted from a safe distance that Becca almost cried about because she thought it was beautiful. The trail through that section is well maintained and popular enough that we passed other hikers regularly, which made both of us feel comfortable. We set up our tent in a designated camping area Saturday night, ate freeze-dried pasta that tasted better than it had any right to, and went to sleep early because we'd planned an early start for the second half of the loop. I woke up just before 3 in the morning needing to use the bathroom. Becca was still asleep and I didn't want to wake her, so I grabbed my headlamp, unzipped the tent as quietly as I could, and walked maybe 40 feet into the trees off the trail. On my way back to the tent, I happened to glance up the slope to the north, back along the direction we'd come from, and I stopped walking. There was a person standing on the trail about 80 feet from me, just standing, still, facing me. At first I assumed it was another hiker and felt silly for being startled, except that it was close to 3 in the morning and this person was not moving at all. They were just standing in the center of the trail, and even at that distance and in the dim cone of my headlamp, I could see that their posture was wrong. Not injured wrong, just wrong. The arms hung too far out from the body, and the head was tilted at an angle that made my stomach drop in a way I couldn't immediately explain. I stood there holding my breath for a few seconds. The figure didn't move, and then it started walking toward me. And I want to be precise about this because it is the detail that has stayed with me every single day since it happened. It was walking toward me, but it was facing away. Its back was to me while it moved in my direction. The legs were moving forward, but the torso and head were oriented in the opposite direction, as if the body had been turned the wrong way at some seam I couldn't see. It covered maybe 10 feet like that before I turned and ran back to the tent. I shook Becca awake, told her something was outside, and we both sat there in the dark, listening for several minutes. Nothing came near the tent. No footsteps, no sound at all. After maybe 30 minutes, Becca fell back asleep, and I lay there with my eyes wide open until the sun started to come up. We hiked out the next morning without saying much. I told Becca what I'd seen, and she didn't laugh at me, which I appreciated, but I could tell she was filing it away in the category of sleep-deprived, overactive imagination. Maybe she's right. I want her to be right. But I know what I saw in that headlamp beam, and whatever it was not moving the way a person moves, not the way anything should move. And it was heading straight toward me from the direction of a trail where, when we hiked back through it in the morning light, there was no footprints in the soft earth on either side of the path. Just ours. Just ours going in and ours going out. Nothing else. Story 3. I almost didn't send this in because I've told this story to 2 people in my life and both of them looked at me like I'd grown a second head. But I've been listening to Park Ranger Files for 2 years and I figured if anyone would take it seriously, it might be this community. My name is Reed Fulton. I'm 41 years old. I'm a high school history teacher in Asheville, and I've been hiking the Smokies since before I could drive. I know those mountains. I know their sounds and their rhythms and their animals. I know what a bear sounds like, moving through rhododendron thickets, which is louder than most people expect. I know what a coyote sounds like at night, and how the sound of a screech owl can make your blood run cold, even if you know exactly what it is. I am not a man who mistakes things. I'm careful and observant, and I have spent more nights in those mountains than most people spend camping in a lifetime. With that said, I do not know what I saw on the north-facing slope above Cosby Campground in October of 2019, but I know it was not a deer. I've been doing an overnight solo trip, something I do every fall as a personal ritual, and I'd camped in a backcountry site maybe 4 miles from the Cosby Trailhead. The night had been uneventful. I'd eaten, hung my bear bag, and turned in early, reading by headlamp until about 9:30 before falling asleep. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, I came fully awake without knowing why. There was no sound, no disturbance I could identify. Just that sudden shift from sleep to complete alertness that happens sometimes in the backcountry when something has changed in the environment around you. I lay still and listened, and after maybe a minute I heard it. A sound from the slope above my tent. Something moving through the leaves. Heavy, slow, deliberate. I've heard bear before at night. I've heard them blowing and snorting and crashing. This was none of those things. It was patient. Whoever or whatever was up on that slope was not stumbling through the forest. It was picking its way down with intention. I unzipped my sleeping bag and reached for my headlamp but didn't turn it on. Something told me not to. Instead, I sat in the tent and listened. The sound got closer, and then it stopped. Absolute silence for what felt like 3 minutes. Then, at maybe 15 feet from the front of my tent, I heard breathing. Long, slow, deep, in and out, in and out. The kind of breathing you do when you're trying to control it, when you're making yourself slow down. It was too slow to be a running animal's breathing, and it was coming from maybe 5 feet off the ground, which would put the head of whatever was out there somewhere around the height of a large man. I sat in that tent and I did not move. Not a single muscle. And then in the most quiet voice I have ever heard, barely above a whisper, something said a word. Just one word. I've turned it over in my head 1,000 times and I still don't know what the word was. It wasn't English. It wasn't Cherokee. And I know a little bit of that language from my research on the region. It was something older, I think. Something I've never heard before or since. I'd brought a pistol, which you are legally allowed to carry in the Smokies, and I had it out of the holster in about 4 seconds. I turned on the headlamp and screamed for whatever was out there to get back. Crashing through the underbrush, something very large moving up that slope at terrifying speed. My headlamp caught it for maybe 1 second as it hit the tree line above me. And this is the part people don't believe. It was moving on all fours, but not the way a bear moves, which is a wide-bodied lumber. This was low and fast and fluid, and on its back, draped over it like a cloak, was the raw hide of a deer. The head of the deer was still attached, and it bounced as the thing ran. I could see the white of the underside. Whatever I saw, it had come down that slope wearing something dead, and it had stood outside my tent and spoken a word into the dark. I fired twice into the trees above the campsite. Then I packed my tent in the dark in about 8 minutes, which is a record I never want to break again. And I moved fast back down that trail with my headlamp bouncing, and my hand on that pistol the whole 4 miles to my car. I've talked to some folks since then, older folks from the Cosby area. And one woman who grew up there wouldn't even let me finish describing what I'd seen. She just put her hand up and told me to stop. Said some things don't need to be named out loud. Said I was lucky it only talked. I believe her. Story 4. I'm going to try to keep this organized because it stretched over 2 days, and I want you to understand the full picture. My name is Gretchen Samuels. I'm 35. I'm a physical therapist in Portland, Maine, and this happened during a solo section hike on the northern terminus of the Appalachian Trail in late August of 2018. Day 1 started completely normally. I thru-hiked the northern 100 miles stretch about once every few years, and I know the terrain well enough that I can move efficiently even with a fully loaded pack. The weather was good, partly cloudy, and I was making excellent time by mid-morning. The first sign was around noon. I stopped to filter water at a stream crossing and had that very specific feeling of being watched that every person who spends real time outdoors knows. It's not panic, it's just an awareness, a prickling at the back of the neck. I scanned the trees on both sides of the stream and saw nothing, and after a minute or two I shouldered my pack and kept going. An hour later I stopped to check my map and looked back down the trail behind me, the way I often do to check on weather coming from the south. Maybe 200 yards back down the trail, partially obscured by a curve in the path and the tree line, there was a figure, standing still watching me. It appeared to be very tall, well over 6 feet I'd guess, and thin in a way that read as wrong even at that distance. The kind of thin where the proportions don't quite add up. It was wearing dark clothing, or at least that's what I told myself. Later I'd wonder if what I was seeing as dark clothing wasn't clothing at all. The arms seemed slightly too long. I called out hello, figuring it was another hiker, and I was misreading the distance and the proportions. The figure didn't respond, it didn't move. I turned and walked faster. I didn't stop early that day. I pushed past my intended campsite to a designated shelter about 3 miles further north, because I wanted other people around me, which is something I've almost never wanted on a solo hike. I got there around 6 in the evening. A man named Todd from Connecticut was already there with his dog, and I can't describe the relief I felt at seeing another human being. I slept okay that night, talked myself down, told myself it was a hiker who hadn't heard me, told myself the proportions were a trick of light and distance. Felt almost foolish by morning. Day 2. I left the shelter at dawn, moving well, and for the first 4 hours, everything was completely normal. I fell into that good meditative rhythm that long-distance hikers know, where the trail just flows under your feet and your mind goes quiet. Around 11 o'clock, I stopped to eat and looked back behind me on an open stretch of ridge. It was there again. Same distance, same stillness, and this time I had my binoculars. I raised them and focused, and I wish I hadn't. I had been right about the height and the proportions. The arms did hang too long. But what I hadn't been able to see from 200 yards with the naked eye was the face, or rather, what should have been a face. At the distance I was looking through those binoculars. With 8 times magnification, I should have been able to make out features. Eyes, nose, a mouth at minimum. There was nothing like that. The face was a pale, blank, smooth oval. No features at all. Just a white surface tilted in my direction. I dropped the binoculars and ran. I know that's not the recommended response to a perceived threat on the trail. I know you're supposed to make yourself look bigger, back away slowly, all of that. But there was no rational category to put what I'd seen through those binoculars into. And when your rational mind fails, your legs take over. I ran for most of a mile before I had to stop and catch my breath. I was shaking. When I looked back, the trail was empty. I made it to my car by late afternoon, having covered in 5 hours what I'd planned to do in 8. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. And when I got to the trailhead and got in my car and locked the doors, I sat there for 10 minutes before I felt calm enough to drive. The thing about that blank face is that it wasn't empty in the sense of expressionless. It was empty in the sense of incomplete, like something had taken a human shape and hadn't finished filling in the details. Like it wasn't sure yet what face to put on. I've been back to Maine. I've been back to those woods in other areas. But I have not gone back to that section of trail, and I don't imagine I ever will. If you are enjoying the channel and you want to support what we're doing here, consider joining the membership. Members get early access to new narrations, bonus content that never goes public, and access to our member-only community where we discuss stories, share experiences, and go deep on some of the cases that I can't fully unpack in the main videos. The link is in the description. Even a few dollars a month keeps this channel running, and it means the world. Now back to the stories. Story 5. My name is Bert Calloway. I'm 60 years old, and I spent 32 years working as a longshoreman in Baltimore before I retired. I am, as my wife puts it, not a man with a very active imagination. She means it as a compliment. I take it as one. I started hiking in retirement because my doctor told me to do something cardiovascular, and I hate gyms with a passion that borders on spiritual. A friend told me to try the Appalachian Trail, that it passed through Pennsylvania not 3 hours from my house, and I figured why not. Bought some decent boots, a second-hand pack, and started doing weekend overnights in the Duncannon section north of Harrisburg. This was 3 summers ago, a Saturday night in July, when the heat hadn't let up even at altitude. I'd set up my camp chair, one of those compact fold-out ones, by the fire and eaten dinner. And around 9 o'clock, I decided to walk about 100 yards down to a small overlook I'd seen on my way in to watch the last of the sunset light leave the valley. Left everything at camp. Left my headlamp on the camp table, which in retrospect was the dumbest thing I've done as a hiker. Figured I'd be back in 10 minutes before it got dark. When I came back, there was someone sitting in my chair. The fire was still going. Hadn't grown or shrunk in the 10 minutes I'd been gone. And sitting in my camp chair in the firelight, with his back to me, was a man. A large man. Broad through the shoulders, with long dark hair hanging to the collar of a coat that was wrong for July. A heavy thing, dark colored. He was just sitting there, very still, facing the fire. My first thought, honest to God, was annoyance. My camp, my chair. I said something like, "Hey friend, that's my spot." Something innocuous. He turned and looked at me over his shoulder. I want to say he was a person. I want to file it there and move on. But I've been thinking about this for 3 years, and the more I turn it over, the more certain I am that what I saw in the firelight when that head turned toward me was not a normal human face. The geometry was off in a way I can't precisely articulate. The eyes were positioned correctly. Nose and mouth were there. But there was something about the spacing, the depth, the way the shadows from the fire fell on those features that made the whole thing read as assembled rather than grown. Like a decent but not perfect approximation. Whatever it was, held my gaze for maybe 3 seconds. Then it stood, slowly, to a height that I'm going to put at 6.5 feet, maybe more, and it walked into the dark tree line on the far side of my camp, with the casual ease of someone who has somewhere to be. No hurry, no acknowledgement of me, beyond that one look over the shoulder. I stood at the edge of my campsite for a while. My headlamp was on the table right next to where that thing had been sitting. I needed it. I made myself walk to the table, pick it up, and I swept the tree line where it had entered. Nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in that chair with the fire stoked as high as I could get it, and my folding knife open in my hand. Nothing came back. In the morning, looking at the chair in daylight, the fabric across the seat was pressed down in a pattern that was different from how I'd been sitting in it. Wider, heavier, and in the soft dirt just at the edge of the firelight, on the side where it had walked into the trees, I found a track. One track, and just one. Like it had set one foot down too heavy on its way out and left an impression. It was large, roughly the shape of a human foot, but longer than any foot I'd ever seen. And the depth of the impression was more than I'd have expected from even a large man, like whatever made it weighed considerably more than it looked. My wife says it was a hiker who wandered into the wrong campsite. I don't tell her about the face. Some things you keep to yourself. Story 6. This was early April, maybe 6 or 7 years back. My name is Naomi Castetter. I'm a 37-year-old vet tech from Atlanta, and I attempted a thru hike that spring that I ended up abandoning after 9 days. And this story is the reason. Springer Mountain is the southern terminus of the Appalachian Trail, the official starting point for northbound thru hikers, and on any given weekend in early April, it is absolutely crawling with excited, fresh-faced hikers who have no idea what the next 5 million steps are going to feel like. I was one of them. Full pack, brand new gaiters, a handwritten list of trail names I'd collected from forums, and approximately zero clue what I was doing. The first 4 days were hard and wonderful, the way the beginning of any big undertaking is. I made trail friends, shared meals and blisters and bad jokes, felt genuinely alive in a way I hadn't in years. On the 5th night, the group I'd been loosely hiking with split up at a shelter, some pushing on, some stopping early, and I ended up camping alone at a flat spot, a quarter mile from the shelter, which I thought was no big deal. Plenty of people around, I told myself, just a few minutes down the trail. I'd been asleep maybe 2 hours when I heard something near my tent, and the word near doesn't quite cover it. It was at my tent, right at the fly, and whatever it was not trying to be quiet. I could hear breathing through the thin nylon, deep and slow and steady. Something was right on the other side of that material. I made myself be perfectly still and perfectly quiet. Bear, I thought. Don't make sudden movements. Don't scream. And then the breathing stopped and something pressed against the outside of the tent. A pressure that traveled across the fly slowly, like a hand being dragged across the surface. And then I heard, clear as anything, a whisper right at the mesh of the inner tent door. I'm going to say that it sounded like a woman's voice, high and thin, and it said, very distinctly, 3 words. I won't repeat them here because I don't fully know why, but they were words asking me to come outside. I did not come outside. I lay absolutely motionless for what felt like an hour. The shelter with all those other hikers might as well have been in another country. That quarter mile felt like it might as well have been 10. Eventually, the pressure on the fly released and the footsteps moved away, but slowly, and they went south, back down the trail, back towards Springer, and I counted them as they faded until I couldn't hear them anymore, and there were too many for any 4-legged animal. I broke down my tent at first light, walked to the shelter, and attached myself to the nearest group of hikers like a barnacle. I never told them why. I made it another 4 days before the combination of fear and sleep deprivation and a turned ankle gave me enough excuse to call my mom and ask her to come get me. I've never told anyone what the voice said, what it asked me to do. I've tried a few times, and every time I get close to the words, something in me just stops. Like saying it out loud would be inviting a question I'm not ready to answer. Story 7. This story is from my husband, which I'm submitting on his behalf, because he refuses to write it down himself. He says putting it on paper makes it more real. His name is Frank Kessler. He's 48, a plumber from Bergen County, New Jersey, and he hiked the New Jersey section of the AT 3 years ago as part of a 10-day trip he took with his brother-in-law, Gary, for Gary's 50th birthday. I'm going to write this in his words as close as I can remember, because he's told me this story exactly twice, both times in the dark, and both times in a very specific flat voice he doesn't usually use. We were on the third night, somewhere near the High Point area, not at High Point itself, but north of it, somewhere in the trees. Gary was a snorer, and I'd woken up and couldn't get back to sleep, so I unzipped and sat at the edge of the tent with a smoke. It was clear, cold for the time of year, maybe mid-May, but cold. Stars were out, and fire was down to nothing. The woods on the slope below the campsite were quiet, and then I noticed they weren't completely dark, which is what got my attention. There was a low glow, faint, bluish, coming from somewhere in the trees about 200 feet down the slope. Not a flashlight, too diffuse for that, and not moving like a flashlight would. I stared at it for a while, trying to figure it out. And while I was looking, I started to notice the shapes near the glow. Standing figures. 4, maybe 5 of them, at the edge of where the light was brightest. They were standing perfectly still in a rough cluster close together, all facing in the same direction, which was uphill, toward me. I sat very still and watched them. They didn't move. The light didn't change. Everything was just perfectly still for what felt like several minutes. I tapped Gary's foot through the tent fabric. He woke up groggy and started to say something, and I told him very quietly to shut up and look. He looked. I know he saw it because I heard his breath change. We both just sat there watching these shapes in that blue glow below us, and none of them moved, not 1 inch, for the entire time we watched. And then all at once they were gone. Light and figures, all of it just gone, between one blink and the next. We didn't talk about it. We went back in the tent, and I don't think Gary slept, but I'm not sure because I was watching the tent door and not his face. In the morning, we packed fast and didn't say a word until we'd been walking for 2 hours. And then Gary said, "I don't know what that was," and I said, "Me neither," and we never talked about it again after that. He's never gone back to the AT. Gary still hikes it. Every year, Gary goes back. Frank thinks Gary might not be right. Story 8. I know exactly what animal sounds like on a mountain at night. I'm 50 years old. My name is Clarence Huff, and I spent 6 years working as a wildlife biologist for the state of Tennessee before I went into consulting. I've identified the calls of every bird and mammal native to the southern Appalachians by ear. I've listened to elk bugle from 30 feet away. I've sat blind while black bears investigated my equipment bag. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand that when I tell you what I heard on Roan Mountain on a night in September of 2016, you have to set aside the idea that I confused it with a fox or a coyote or a screech owl or any other normal explanation people reach for. I was doing a survey of high-elevation spruce fir habitat above the tree line on Roan, camping solo over 3 nights to record vegetation health and presence of red crossbill, a species of interest in those bald areas. Second night, I'd set up on the southern edge of a grassy, bald tent staked into wind-hardened soil, the kind of camping that is all weather and no shelter, but with views that make up for everything. Midnight, roughly, I woke up because something was screaming. The word screaming doesn't quite cover it. It was a sustained, high-rising sound that came from the forested slope below the bald, maybe a quarter mile down from where I was. And it was wrong in ways I can describe precisely. The pitch changed too smoothly, without the catches and breaks you'd hear in a mammalian scream, without the mechanical quality of a bird of prey. It was more like hearing a theremin, played by someone who understood the physiology of fear, who knew exactly what frequencies would reach down into the base of your skull and make your body want to shut down. It went on for 30 seconds, maybe longer, then stopped. In the silence after, I heard something moving on the bald itself, on the grass above the tree line where I was camped. The footsteps were light but audible, coming from the north end of the bald, moving toward me. I sat up and reached for my recording equipment out of pure professional habit, which in retrospect seems insane. Whatever survival reflex had wired me to reach for a microphone instead of a weapon in that moment, I can't explain it. The footsteps came closer and then stopped about 60 feet north of my tent. And then the screaming started again. But this time it was close. It was so close I felt it in my teeth, and it was coming from the direction of whatever had just walked across that bald toward me. I have a very loud compressed air alarm, the kind you use for marine safety, that I carry on solo fieldwork. I pointed it north and triggered it. The sound was enormous on that open hillside. Immediate movement. Whatever it was moved back across the bald fast, very fast, and into the forest below, and I heard hitting tree branches as it went, and there were branches up high, higher than a bear would reach, higher than anything should reach on that slope. The silence that came back was complete. Not gradual. Complete. I got my recording equipment back in its case and wrote up my survey notes from that night through until dawn, because there was nothing else to do, and because keeping my hands moving on paper was the only thing that felt manageable. My handwriting in those notes is perfectly calm, which tells me I was in shock. I've never heard that sound again. I've looked for a match in every sound library I've had access to. I've played it back in my head 10,000 times and applied everything I know about bioacoustics to it. It doesn't match anything. It doesn't match anything that lives on this continent. And whatever was screaming, it walked upright on that bald, and it reached high into those trees. And I think it was angry that I was there. Story 9. My name is Rosalind Tanner. I'm 44 years old, and I run a small landscaping business in Charlottesville. I've been hiking the Virginia section of the AT for about 15 years, usually with my dog, a big shepherd mix named Cargo, who is the most fearless animal I've ever met in my life. He has not flinched once at bears, rattlesnakes, or thunderstorms. On an overnight trip to the section of trail around the Priest, a dramatic summit in Nelson County, in October of 2021, Cargo spent an entire night refusing to leave my sleeping bag, pressed into me, shaking, which he has never done before or since. We'd arrived at the Priest shelter in late afternoon and set up camp nearby rather than in the shelter itself, which I prefer. I cooked, ate, watched the valley below go pink and then dark, and turned in around 8:30 with Cargo curled at my feet as usual. Around 11, he woke me up. I know his sleep sounds and his awake sounds, and he was awake and alert, his body rigid against my legs. I put my hand on his back and felt him trembling, which stopped me cold. I clicked on my headlamp and immediately swept the outside of the tent through the mesh. The trees in front of the tent, maybe 20 feet out, were empty. Then I moved the headlamp to the right side, and there was a man standing in the shadow of a large oak at the edge of the light. Just standing, arms at his sides, looking at the tent. He was close enough that I could see he was wearing what looked like old-fashioned work clothes, the heavy dark kind, and his face was pale, very pale. He was not moving. I said something loud and direct about being armed, and he should go away. Cargo was trembling and not barking, which was the single most frightening thing about the whole situation, because Cargo has barked at rocks shaped like dogs before. The man did not move. He stood in that shadow, and he did not move at all for what felt like a full minute. And then he stepped backward, once, twice, 3 steps back, slowly, and was gone into the dark behind him. Not into the trees, not moving around the camp, just backwards into the dark, like the dark closed around him. I kept the headlamp on for an hour. Never heard footsteps moving away. Never heard branches moving. Nothing. By morning, I convinced myself I'd been half asleep and dreamed it. And I almost believed that, except for one thing. When I broke camp and walked to the spot where he'd been standing, at the base of that oak, the grass was not just flattened, but blackened in a rough outline. Scorched almost, as if something very cold or very hot had stood there for a long time. I touched it, thinking perhaps an animal had left some chemical trace, but it just felt like dead grass, completely dead, black and brittle and gone. I took a photo. I still have it. No hiker I've spoken to since has been able to explain what would kill grass in that pattern, in that shape, overnight. Cargo has never had a problem on any hike before or since, but he will not approach the section of trail near the priest. He sits down and he won't move, and I've learned not to argue with him about it. Story 10. This is the one I've been the most reluctant to submit. Not because I think you'll disbelieve me, but because writing it down means thinking it through clearly. And there are parts of this that I've been deliberately keeping blurry in my head for my own peace of mind. My name is Wes Pemberton. I'm 38, I'm a software developer, I work remote, and I've been doing section hikes on the AT in Vermont and New Hampshire for about 6 years. The Vermont section is beautiful and less traffic than you'd expect for a state that's almost entirely forest. I was doing a 4-day solo trip in early September, and on the second day, I'd stopped for lunch at a viewpoint on a ridge near Killington. I'd been talking to myself a little, which I do when I hike alone, narrating decisions out loud, saying things like, "Okay, Wes, what's the plan?" in the way that lonely hikers sometimes do. I finished lunch and kept hiking. That night at my camp in the trees below the ridge, I woke up at an hour I can't pinpoint exactly. 2, maybe 3 in the morning, wide awake, instantly. The way you go when something triggers you out of sleep. Silence. Heavy. Complete. And then from somewhere in the dark outside my tent, maybe 30 feet away, a voice said my name. Not a yell, not a call. It said my name the way you say someone's name when they're sitting right next to you, at conversational volume. My full first name, correctly pronounced, with a slight upward inflection at the end like a question, like, "Wes?" I lay completely still. 20 seconds of nothing. And then again, "Wes?" Same volume, same inflection, but from a different direction. Closer, and then a third time, from directly outside the tent wall nearest my head, so close I could feel the vibration of it, just absolutely inches away. "Wes." No question mark that time. Flat, a statement. I held my breath. I pressed my back against the opposite tent wall and held my breath, and I did not say a single word. And whatever I'd learned about human interaction and about what you do when someone calls your name, every single reflex to respond was screaming at me. Every social instinct said answer. Every survival instinct said, "Don't." I didn't answer. After what felt like 5 minutes of silence, I heard something move away from the tent. Slow footsteps through the leaves, moving north. They faded gradually. In the morning, I packed quickly, and as I was lifting my tent stakes, I noticed the leaves around the north side of my tent, the side where the voice had been closest. They were undisturbed everywhere except for one small area where the leaves had been swept aside in a rough arc, as if someone had crouched there for an extended period and shifted their weight once or twice. That arc was small. Whoever or whatever crouched there was not large, which is perhaps the most disturbing element of the whole thing, because a small thing that speaks with a human voice and knows your name in a forest where you've been completely alone for 36 hours is harder to rationalize than a large one. Large things I have categories for. I've told this story to 2 friends who hike. One told me it was another hiker who'd overheard my talking to myself on the ridge. I sat with that explanation for a while. I want it to be true. But another hiker who'd overheard my name would have said, "Hey," or "Hello," or would have asked if I was all right. They would not have crouched in the leaves outside my tent at 2 in the morning and said my name in the dark like they were checking whether I was home. Okay, friends, quick pause here. If you've got a story of your own, something you've never been able to explain, something that happened out in those woods and that you've been sitting on for years, send it in. The email is in the description. I read everything. Your story might be the next one I feature, and if you're watching on YouTube, drop a question in the comments below. Tell me which story hit hardest tonight, or ask something about the trail sections we've covered. I want to hear from you. The comments section is always the best part of any upload. Story 11. My name is Simone Arcan. I'm 26 years old, originally from Quebec, now living in Manchester, New Hampshire. And I've been an avid hiker since my father took me into the Laurentians as a small girl. I moved to New Hampshire partly because of its proximity to the White Mountains and the northern section of the Appalachian Trail, which is some of the most dramatic and challenging terrain in the entire eastern United States. This happened in late July of last year on a section of trail I know extremely well, because I've walked it at least a dozen times. I was doing a day hike from the trailhead, no overnight gear, just a pack with water, food, a first aid kit, and rain gear. The day was clear and cool, perfect hiking weather. And I was about 5 miles in when I passed a man on the trail. That sounds completely normal. People pass on the trail constantly. But there was something about this man that made me step to the side and watch him as he passed me, which is not something I usually do. He was walking south downhill in the direction I'd come from. He appeared to be in his mid-60s, gray-haired, thin, with a very deliberate and steady walking pace. Not slow, not fast, just precise. He was wearing old-fashioned hiking clothes, the kind that haven't been popular since the 70s or early 80s. A heavy anorak, wool trousers, leather boots with old hardware. He had no pack at all, not even a day pack, just his hands at his sides. No water bottle, no snacks, no map. Nothing. He didn't look at me as he passed. His eyes were fixed on the trail ahead of him. I said bonjour out of habit, then corrected to good morning. He didn't respond, didn't look up, kept walking. I watched him for a moment, and then kept going north. I hiked another 4 miles, ate lunch at a viewpoint, and then turned around and headed back south. On the return trip, about 2 miles from where I'd seen the man, I came around a turn and there he was, walking south, same pace, same posture, eyes fixed forward, same direction. I'd been walking south too, and I'd been moving faster than his steady pace suggested he was capable of, and yet here he was, ahead of me, walking in the same direction. I said, "Excuse me," in English. He didn't respond. I pushed my pace until I was walking alongside him and looked at his face. He was staring straight ahead, and his eyes, I need to say this carefully, his eyes were not tracking. They were open and forward, and they were not reacting to light or movement or anything. The eyelids were not blinking at a normal rate, and his face was deeply pale with a grayish cast to it that I've seen before in patients in certain medical situations. I asked if he was all right. He turned his head and looked at me. The eyes were not right. I've thought about how to describe this for a year, and the best I can do is to say that there was a quality of absence in them, like the mechanism behind them had been switched off. He looked at me with those eyes for 3 full seconds, and then turned his head forward again and kept walking. I jogged ahead of him, turned around, and tried to look at his face from the front. He walked straight toward me at his unchanged pace, and at the last second walked around me without altering his stride at all, without looking at me, just perfectly smoothly altering his path to go around the obstruction I was making and continuing south. I stood in the trail watching him go. He walked around a bend and out of sight. I ran after him. Around the bend, the trail was empty. I was looking at a straight section of 300 yards with no turnoffs, no branching paths, no place to go. He was gone. That evening at the trailhead, I asked 2 other hikers who'd been coming off the same trail if they'd seen an older man in vintage gear, no pack, walking south. They both said no. One of them had been on that exact stretch of trail for most of the day and had seen no one matching that description. I've gone back to that section 4 times since then. I haven't seen him again. I'm glad, and yet I'm watching for him every time. Story 12. I'll keep my name out of this if that's all right. I've got kids and a job that requires some public credibility, and I don't need people associating me with this. You can call me by a different name if you want. Use Thea. That works. I'm 42, I'm an attorney, and my husband Garrett and I do a section of the Appalachian Trail together every year as a kind of anniversary tradition, which started the year we got married and which we've kept up for 14 years. We like the sections in Maryland and West Virginia because they're close to us and we know them well. This was 2 years ago, the section passing through Harper's Ferry, which is historically significant and also just gorgeous, where the Shenandoah and Potomac rivers meet below a series of dramatic cliffs. We'd done this section before and knew it well, and we'd booked an inn in Harper's Ferry for the second night, which made the camping feel lower stakes, like we had a soft exit available. The first night we camped south of town. Uneventful. Beautiful even. We ate well and slept well and woke up early to a foggy riverside morning that felt like something out of a painting. The second day we were moving north toward town, going to pass under the railroad bridge that crosses the Potomac, which is a well-known feature of this section of trail, and a spot we'd passed through at least 3 times before. The bridge underpass was in shadow, the water was maybe 15 feet below us, and the trail runs along a narrow stone path that's essentially the underside of the bridge support. It's cool and a little echoey, and usually takes maybe 40 seconds to walk through. Halfway through, Garrett stopped. I almost walked into him. I asked what was wrong. He pointed to the far side of the underpass, to the shadows at the southern exit. Something was crouching in the shadow there, at the edge of where the light met the dark, maybe 15 feet ahead of us. Crouching low, and the body was angled toward us, and even in that deep shadow, I could see the eyes catching some reflected light from the river. Bright, like an animal's eyes in headlights. That reflective quality. But positioned at the height of a crouching human, not a low-bodied animal. We both stopped and stared. It didn't move. We didn't move. Garrett is not a man who startles. He played football in college and has about as much natural fear response as a parking cone. But he took hold of my wrist and stepped back, putting himself slightly between me and the thing in the shadow. And then it made a sound. I don't have another word for it besides a click. A series of rapid clicking sounds, like a sonar ping, and then it moved. It didn't walk. It is the most inadequate word for what it did. It went sideways along the stone wall of the bridge support with the kind of fluid, total body movement that suggests joints oriented differently than a human skeleton. It hit the wall. It seemed to travel along it. It was in shadow, so I cannot give you a precise account of what its body did. And then it was on the ceiling of the bridge underpass, and then it was gone, up and over and out. Garrett and I stood in that underpass for about 30 seconds without speaking. We walked out the other side very fast, didn't look up as we cleared the bridge, and were back on open trail in the sunshine before either of us said anything. We hiked the rest of the way to Harper's Ferry in something like 3/4 of the time it should have taken us. At dinner at the inn, over a bottle of wine that we finished faster than usual, Garrett said, "I don't want to talk about what that was," and I said, "Neither do I." And we ordered dessert and talked about our kids. We haven't been back to that section. Next year, we're planning the Vermont section instead. Neither of us has said explicitly that the change of plan is because of the bridge. Neither of us needs to. Story 13. I haven't slept well since this happened, and it's been 18 months. I've tried to write this down 3 times and stopped each time because I don't want it to be real. But here it is. My name is Owen Burkett. I'm 33 years old. I work in forestry, which means I've been in remote woods by myself for much of my adult life, and I'm not going to be mistaken about what I'm describing. Late November, the standing Indian area of the Nantahala National Forest, which the Appalachian Trail passes through in the far southwestern corner of North Carolina. A section of trail I'd scouted for work purposes, checking on some reforestation plots, not a recreational trip. I was staying 2 nights alone in a camper van I'd parked at the lower trailhead. The first night was cold and uneventful. The second night I woke up at some point around midnight, to the sound of what I can only describe as children playing. Voices, laughing. The kind of chaotic overlapping sound of 3 or 4 kids just running around outside, in that unself-conscious way kids have. High voices, quick words I couldn't make out. Movement sounds, like they were chasing each other around the van. I lay in my sleeping bag in the van trying to make sense of what I was hearing. There was no campground nearby, no parking for families. The nearest residential area was miles down a dirt road. And it was midnight in late November in 40-degree temperatures. There were no children who had any logical business being outside in the dark in those woods. The playing sounds continued for a few minutes. I sat up and looked out the van window. Nothing visible. Just the dark tree line and the stars. And then one of the children knocked on the van door. A small fist. Rap, rap, rap. The way a child does when they want to come in. And then a small voice right at the door said, "We're cold. Can we come in?" The voice sounded young, 7 or 8 years old. A girl, I thought. And the word we indicated she wasn't alone. I sat completely still. "We're cold," she said again. And then there were sounds of multiple children at the door. More small hands, more voices, all slightly different, all young, all saying versions of the same thing. They were cold. They wanted to come in. They just wanted to get warm. I want to be clear about something because I've thought about it a lot since. I work in the outdoors. I've been trained in wilderness first aid and emergency response. If there had been any scenario in which actual lost children were outside my van in near freezing temperatures at midnight, my professional training and my basic humanity would have overridden anything else. I would have opened that door. I didn't open the door. Because as I sat in the dark, listening to those voices, something about them shifted in a way that I cannot fully articulate. It wasn't the words, it wasn't the pitch. It was a quality underneath the pitch, like a second sound running below the first. Too low to be a child's vocal register, something that was using a child's voice the way a ventriloquist uses a puppet. And the repetition was wrong. Real lost children in distress don't repeat the same short phrases over and over in slightly varying order. They escalate, they cry, they panic. These voices just kept circling through the same sounds with an uncanny mechanical patience. "We're cold. Can we come in? We just want to get warm." Over and over. I turned on every light in the van. I put it in gear and I drove. The voices continued around the van as I started moving and kept up with the van for what I'm going to conservatively estimate at 40 yards down the dirt road before falling silent. I drove to a gas station in town, parked under the lights in the lot, and sat until morning. I filed no report. What would I say? There are no words for the official record that cover this. Instead, I got back in those woods at dawn in daylight and finished my survey work like a professional. And then I went home and I called my sister and I talked to her for 2 hours about nothing in particular because I needed to hear a normal human voice. I have a 4-year-old niece. I will never in my life forget the difference between the way she laughs and the sound of those voices outside the van. There is a quality in real children that those voices were missing, something I don't have a name for, some warmth or randomness or life that just wasn't there. They wanted me to open the door. Whatever they were, they wanted in, and whatever would have happened if I'd opened it. I am grateful every day that I didn't. Story 14. My name is Amber Rozak. I'm 28 and I teach elementary school in Allentown, Pennsylvania. I hike the Pennsylvania sections of the AT a few times a year because it's local and I know it well, which is the exact thing that makes what happened in this story so hard to accept. I was on a day hike last October with my friend Lexi, who was visiting from out of state and wanted to do something active. We did a section south of Port Clinton, a moderately trafficked stretch that I'd hiked at least 4 times. We had a perfect day, good weather, we took a lot of photos, and we drove home feeling good. That evening, Lexi and I were going through our photos over dinner, sending each other favorites to share. Normal stuff. I was scrolling through a sequence I'd taken at a viewpoint overlooking a valley. I'd taken 4 photos in quick succession of the same view from the same spot, turning slightly between each one to get a panoramic sense of the scene. Lexi is in the third one, standing at the overlook railing, looking out at the view. In the fourth photo, which I took less than 3 seconds after the third, there is someone standing directly behind Lexi. I was the only other person there. I took the photo. Lexi was at the railing and standing approximately 3 feet behind her, so close they could have reached out and touched her shoulder, is a figure that I did not see when I took the photo. A tall, pale figure in dark clothing, with its face turned directly toward the camera, directly toward me. The face is not clear. The resolution is fine. My phone camera is good. But the face in the photo is somehow indistinct in a way that the rest of the image is not. Not blurry, not out of focus. Just wrong. Like the pixels in that area are arranged in a way that suggests a face without resolving into one. I showed Lexi. She went pale. We had not seen anyone else on the trail for at least 45 minutes before or after that viewpoint. There was nowhere to come from, and nowhere to go without being visible on the trail. And in 3 seconds between the third and fourth photograph, this figure appeared behind my friend and then was gone again. Because by the time I would have taken a fifth photo, it was not there. I've looked at that photograph maybe 100 times. I've zoomed in, I've adjusted the exposure and contrast. I've sent it to 2 photographer friends and asked them to explain it. One told me it looked like a real person and asked why I was worried about a random hiker. I said, look at the face. She looked at the face. She sent the photo back without comment. Lexi asked me to delete it, and I almost did. I still have it. I don't know why I kept it. Maybe because deleting it felt like agreeing that the thing in it had the right to be unseen. Or maybe because I'm morbid. Probably both. The worst part isn't the photograph. The worst part is that I know the viewpoint it was taken at, and I know exactly where you'd have to stand to frame the shot the way I did, and I was standing there. And that means whatever was 3 feet behind my friend was also approximately 3 feet in front of me. And I didn't see it. I didn't feel it. I didn't register it at all. I was looking right at it through my camera screen, and something about it, whatever it was not visible to my eyes in real time, only to the lens. I don't know what to do with that. I don't know what it means. I just know that viewpoint is somewhere I will never stand again. Story 15. This is the last story, and I want to give it the space it deserves. The person who sent this in asked me to change their name, and I've honored that. I'm calling them Ray. They're 55 years old, and they live in central Maine, and they've been hiking the Maine backcountry since they were a teenager. Ray hiked into the Gulf Haggis area alone in early September, a section of remote country near the AT corridor in Piscataquis County. Gulf Haggis is sometimes called Maine's Grand Canyon, a dramatic slate gorge along the Pleasant River, and it is staggeringly beautiful and extremely remote. Ray had done this trip before and was comfortable with the terrain. On the first night, camped at a flat spot near the gorge rim, Ray woke up at approximately 1 a.m. to a sound they describe as singing. Not music, not a tune, a sustained wordless tonal sound coming from multiple sources in the forest around the camp, overlapping, harmonizing in a way that Ray says, and this is a quote, felt like it was aimed at something specific, like the sound was for a purpose I wasn't meant to understand. Ray lay still and listened for a long time. The singing, if that's the right word, moved around the camp slowly over the course of maybe 20 minutes, never getting closer, never getting further, just maintaining a steady perimeter of sound. And then from the direction of the gorge, which was perhaps 60 yards from the campsite, something large splashed in the water below. Once. And the singing stopped at the same instant, like a switch. Silence. After a few minutes, Ray heard footsteps. Single set. Moving away from the gorge and toward the campsite, slow and heavy on the ground. They came to within maybe 30 feet of the tent and stopped. Ray had a headlamp. They turned it on and looked through the tent mesh. Standing in the light at the edge of the camp was a figure unlike anything Ray has been able to categorize in 55 years of living in Maine and decades of outdoor experience. It was tall, 7 feet, Ray estimates, possibly more. It stood upright on 2 legs, but the silhouette was wrong in too many ways to list. The shoulders too wide, the head too large, the neck too long. It was wet, visibly wet, glistening in the headlamp beam, as if it had just come out of the river below. It stood in the light for what Ray says felt like a full minute, but was probably 10 seconds. And then it crouched, down low, fast, the way a person ducks when they're startled. And in that crouch, it turned its head toward the tent, and Ray saw the eyes. 2 pale points of light in the dark below the face, too low, like the eyes were placed in the lower half of the head rather than the upper. Ray made a sound, not intentional, just a sound. And the thing unfolded itself from the crouch and stepped backward, once, twice, and then was gone into the dark in the direction of the gorge with a speed that Ray says was total and absolute, like a light being switched off. Ray packed their tent in the dark in what they describe as a kind of mechanical, dissociated calm, the way the brain goes when it has processed more than it has categories for. They hiked out by headlamp, 4 miles in the dark, on trail they know well, and reached their truck just before 3 in the morning. Has not been back to the Gulf Haggis area since. They continue to hike other sections of Maine backcountry, but not that area, and not ever alone. And on the particular question of what they saw that night, Ray says simply that they no longer needed to have a name. They saw what they saw, and whatever it was, it came out of that river and it crouched and looked at them and it left. And Ray is alive and intact and chooses to interpret that as having been lucky. I think Ray is right. I also think Ray is braver than I would have been. That's all 15 stories for tonight. I hope you're safe, I hope your doors are locked, and I really hope you're not listening to this while camping. But if you are, well, leave a light on. Before you go, a few things for me. First, if you've been on the fence about subscribing, tonight is the night. Hit that subscribe button and the bell icon so you don't miss a single upload. This channel is built on this community, and every single subscriber genuinely matters to keeping it going. Stay safe out there, friends. Stay on the marked trails. And if you hear something calling your name in the dark, do not answer it. Good night.